we'll start with the question of the day for polling. And the question of the day is, how many sacks Danielle Hunter and Zadaria Smith will combine for this year? A, over 20, B, 10 to 20, or C, under 10. They had 27 sacks combined 2 years ago. Last year, with Hunter only playing 7 games and Zadaria Smith missing the whole year, they combined for 6. And I think that this is a good entry into our somewhat surprising projection for the Vikings, because part of the projection is the defense improving, and part of the defensive improvement is not just the rookies they've added, but adding Zadaria Smith and getting Hunter back. But I don't know if I sort of overestimated what Zadaria Smith will be coming back from injury. So I guess that's the first question is, what do you think, Matthew, about the pass rush this year and what they're going to expect from those guys, and not a lot of depth behind them?
Yeah, I remember seeing a tweet from somebody that said every team that's mediocre thinks if we just stay healthy at all of our positions, then we'll be pretty great. And, I think that's this conversation when it comes to Zadaria Smith and Danielle Hunter is like, if they are both healthy, then the answer could be over 20 for sure. But that's kind of a stretch. I mean, when you think about Zadaria Smith initially signed a contract with the Baltimore Ravens, and then all of a sudden that disappeared and he shows up here. And if you use our friends at overthecap.com and you poke around over there and look at the contracts, you go, oh, okay, so that $42 million over 3 years isn't really $42 million over 3 years. It's more like a year-to-year contract for Zadaria Smith, which makes you think that there's some skepticism about his health. So, I mean, if I'm answering the question, I would have to go in the middle, 10 to 20, because it's just hard to believe in Zadaria Smith's health coming off a back injury. And with Danielle Hunter, he missed last year with a torn pec, which is not generally a huge deal. But the problem is he also missed 2 years ago with a neck injury that required surgery. And so now you're talking about multiple injuries adding up together. If both of these guys are healthy, they're two of the best players in the NFL at their positions. Danielle Hunter is still 27 years old. So I think that it's more possible he can play the full season and be a dominant player. Also, I think Ed Donatell's system, they're going to move these guys around. They're going to be creative, especially with Zadaria Smith. And I think that could benefit them quite a bit. I'm just skeptical of those guys both adding up to enough games to get 27 sacks again. And then you mentioned when you go to the depth on this team, the drop off from Danielle Hunter and Zadaria Smith to the next guy. Name a backup pass rusher for the Minnesota Vikings. I mean, they've drafted some in the past. They haven't developed them very well. They're hoping someone like Patrick Jones or Janarius Robinson can rise to the occasion, but we haven't really seen any evidence that that's actually going to happen. And this is the story of the Vikings defense the last few years. When they're healthy, they should be pretty good. But when you go one level down from the starters, it gets pretty dark. And I think that that's still the case with this defense, and why I would say, because so much of it relies on those two players, that I'm not sure how good they can be over a 17-game season.
Yeah, I'll agree that the depth is really bad in the front seven. Like, looking at their depth chart on our lads, the only position where it really looks like they have depth on defense is the secondary, in particular because either the rookie Andrew Booth or Cameron Dantzler will be the fourth cornerback. So that's some depth, but the front seven has like none.
Right. And even then, I mean, when you think about the cornerback group, the only player that is making any money is Patrick Peterson, and it's not much money. It's like Cameron Dantzler has not over a full season really proven himself. Andrew Booth, as you mentioned, is a rookie. And watching his college tape, I think there's tons of reasons to be excited about Andrew Booth. But the problem is, once again, we're talking about a guy who's had serious health concerns, multiple recent surgeries. And he said after the draft that he hasn't been healthy since high school. It's not exactly what you want to hear, right? And there's a reason, I think, also when you go back and watch him play football, you're like, this guy should really be a first-round pick. And so there's a reason that he wasn't. And so then all of a sudden you start to talk about kind of a house of cards here. It's like an older Patrick Peterson who was okay last year, but if he falls off, then you're in trouble. A rookie that you're relying on. Shandon Sullivan seems to be kind of just a guy who can play nickel corner. And then after that, like, who's coming? But there is an interesting player in their secondary, though, Cam Bynum, who stepped in last year for a couple games. And honestly, a really, really smart player. And everyone raved about how he played last year. And I thought he was legitimately good stepping in for Harrison Smith. So this gives them some options of, could you move him to nickel if you had to? Can you play 3 safety stuff, which is something that Mike Zimmer always talked about wanting to do, but never decided to do it. And so I think Ed Donatel will want to do some of the 3 safety stuff and be a little creative there. And also if Lewis Seen, hey, first round picks, we always just type them into the depth chart as starters. If he's not ready right away, then they have somebody else there. But that's really the only depth. And I think that's where you look at the defense and get concerned, because even though they've struggled to create pass rush over the last few years, they also couldn't cover anybody. I mean, Bashad Breeland struggled. Mackenzie Alexander struggled last year. The rookies in 2020. So are we in for the kind of the same redux of that, where it's like you could talk yourself into it at camp, but as soon as something goes wrong, then it all falls apart? Or I've also covered seasons where everyone stayed healthy and it worked out. And so, you never really can predict that. And I think that's why defenses are so hard to project in general, is because how do I know which cornerbacks or which defensive linemen are going to get banged up?
I just want to say I love the Cam Bynum shout out. That guy is good. He was actually he played corner at Cal. If you aren't like super into the draft, you might not know that, but yeah, he was a corner at Cal. He actually beat the bricks out of Brandon Ayuk when they played. And that was kind of why I liked him. But now at safety, yeah, he's just like a really smart physical player. I feel like generally if you're a cornerback moving to safety, you kind of have to be really good in the brain department. And I think he is. And like Matthew said, like, even if it's just to be a backup and a third safety, like, there's value in that. I think especially with like more teams experimenting with that. And then because of his corner chops, I think you can like be okay leaving him as like, if you need to bump him down to the slot a little bit and stuff. So I really like him. I will say, yeah, he's probably their best depth player, at least for my mind.
Yeah, and there's kind of a thing with Ed Donatel's defense where they're talking about how can we be creative, because with Mike Zimmer, it was mostly static. Now, I'm sure he changed details of how do you handle this motion or how do you handle certain route combinations and so forth. Those are hard to pick up on unless he tells you that those are the assignments he changed. But as far as how he wanted to play defense, nickel, Kendrickson bar there, Harrison Smith moving around and things like that. So you can talk yourself into, there's a lot of creative ways that players can be used. Harrison Smith could do anything on a football field. And Lewis Seen coming downhill, I think, is a special player. So how can you, mix those things in? Can you blitz them? Can you run, different coverages that are disguises and all these things? But the real question is, can everybody master the scheme here? Because I was looking at just the training camp schedule, and, we know that preseasons are shortened, and I don't even know if Kevin O'Connell wants starters to play in the preseason. There's only a handful of practices.
The Rams, he doesn't.
Yeah, right. Which I think overall is smart, because last year they lost Irv Smith Jr. to an injury for the season in the 3rd preseason game. It's just senseless. But at the same time, like, adapting a lot of new faces to a completely new defense. Kendricks, Hunter is doing something different now. He's going to be standing up more often. And Harrison Smith, I mean, he's an incredibly smart player, but he's been playing for Mike Zimmer since 2014. So how do these guys adapt to all those things? And also, is there a little bit of, well, we can do, all these creative things with guys, right? But you also have to make sure you've got the fundamental parts to it. And I think that that's one of the things that just, again, makes defense so difficult is you have a new linebacker, you got a new, scheme, you got a new safety who's a rookie, and all of these people have to be on the same page, because if there's one mistake, you're playing Aaron Rodgers in the first week, he's going to find it, even if he doesn't have Devontae Adams.
When you look at the individual Vikings projections, they don't look weird. It's when you add them all up that it looks weird. Like their defensive projection, the average of the range of possibilities comes out 18th. Well, they were like 16th on defense last year and 18th the year before. So being 18th this year makes a lot of sense. Their offensive projection comes out, I think, 7th, which is a little higher than they were last year. Last year, they were only 16th, but they were 8th and 10th the 2 years before that. And a big reason for their offensive projection is that Kirk Cousins is always kind of good. Like, he's always statistically like the 10th or 11th best quarterback in the league. And he's like the king of the win with guys, right? He's not a guy you win because of, but he always comes out with good production, and he's kind of consistent. So the offense, is going to be a new offensive scheme with O'Connell. but the same good pieces that have been on the offense in years past. What do you say about the offense? I mean, do you think that the projection is sort of 7th or 8th in the league is too high, or do you think that sounds reasonable?
I would call it enthusiastic, maybe. I think that, there's a lot of great quarterbacks in the league who are leading really explosive offenses. Now, if we kind of section it off to the NFC, you could see it. Like, that's what really matters, right? Is getting in the NFC playoffs. And you could see where Kirk Cousins could lead one of the 3 or 4 best offenses in the NFC. It's probably not going to be better than Tampa Bay, Green Bay, or Los Angeles. But for that next spot, I mean, Arizona, whatever San Francisco is going to do, Dallas, of course, in the mix. And you could see the Vikings getting in that conversation and having that drive them to a playoff berth, but not a legitimate candidacy for being a Super Bowl team, which has kind of been the best case scenario since Kirk Cousins got here. And the funny thing about Kirk Cousins and his consistency is that he's consistently inconsistent over a season. A couple of years ago, a couple off seasons ago, I charted all of the QBRs in individual games and just looked at how much he went up and down and had these wild, like, player of the month in October. And then what the heck happened in December, or why did he start the season like that? And then, oh my gosh, he bounced back. He's never, and I know that all quarterbacks are kind of like this, but he's kind of an extreme. Here they call him the Kirk coaster, because it's always circumstances. It's always how well it's drawn up. Does everyone stay healthy? Again, because last year when they lost Thielen, like, go look at how he played when they lost Thielen and had to be KJ Osborne. It was not pretty. So are they healthy? Is the offensive line healthy and holding up? Is the scheme working? And then what's the schedule look like? Because his best year in 2019, when they finished 8th in points, everything came together. They were mostly healthy. Kevin Stefanski was fantastic. And they had one of the easiest schedules, like, in Vikings history. And so this year you look at the schedule and you go, there might be some good defenses there, but I'm not really convinced that the AFC East outside of Buffalo and the NFC East are the most dangerous to be paired up with, which leads you to believe, and this may have been factored in their decision to keep Cousins, leads you to believe that they have a chance to be a fringe top 10 offense, but that would be good enough to get them to the playoffs.
They do have one of the easier projected schedules in the league by our numbers. And I will answer the question from Colonel Kurtz about, isn't the first year in a new defense usually kind of bad? Yeah, the fact is, when you have a new scheme on both defense and offense, all other things being equal, you take a little bit of a step backwards. So that's one of the reasons why the Vikings projection was sort of surprising, because all the other stuff in the projection system outweighed the fact that they're in new schemes on both sides of the ball.
I think it mostly comes down to the offensive line, because they didn't change the receivers at all. I mean, like, they're basically running back with the same.
Just getting Irv Smith back.
Guys.
That's it.
Yeah, they're getting Irv Smith back, which, like, to me, like, that's nice, but it's not really moving the needle for what I think about the offense necessarily. So it really just comes down to, like, can Ed Ingram play really well at guard out of the gate? Can Garrett Bradbury maybe finally take another step? Can Christian Darrisaw take a step? Which that one I actually expect to happen. I thought he was fine as a rookie, and you expect a first rounder to take a step in year 2. So to me, it really just comes down to the offensive line, not even just for pass protection, but for, like, running the ball, because I think Dalvin Cook is one of the most explosive runners in the NFL. If you can get him a couple more runways a game, he's going to make good on that. And I think that, like, dramatically changes the offense, like, where they're getting production. And I think that obviously makes things easier for Kirk, who loves that play action structure. And if you can get the run game going, I think it's all going to work together for O'Connell.
Yeah. So the thing about this is, like, if you have like a 50-50 chance at 4 different things that all need to happen, somebody tell me what the odds are, but I know it's not good. That's kind of like talking about the offense for being elite. You need right guard play. So I'm not even sure that Ingram is going to be the one who starts, because they brought in Jesse Davis and Chris Reed, 2 veterans, and neither one of them have, a past history that would suggest they are needle movers either. Garrett Bradbury's not going to change his stripes, more likely than not. The interior pressure is where Kirk Cousins is at his worst, is when people are coming up the middle. Actually, from the outside pressure, they spent a first rounder on Darrisaw, but it's never really been an issue for Kirk Cousins because he stays in the same spot in the pocket and people just kind of run by him a lot of times. But Darrisaw was hurt a couple times last year, and not getting another wide receiver, I think, was the biggest surprise of the entire offseason to me, because if you're leaning into Kirk Cousins, you're signing him to an extension, and you're saying Mike Zimmer was the bad man, it was all his fault, even though he had Gary Kubiak and Kevin Stefanski running the offense. But if you're making that case that it was Mike Zimmer's fault, the old crotchety defensive man, wouldn't you want to try to make yourself right by like drafting Jamison Williams or signing another wide receiver or something? I think that was the biggest surprise to me, because now if Thielen or Jefferson is gone for even a game or two and you want to play 11 personnel, like who's coming in there? I mean, they really need during this camp somebody to step up and show that they can be a playmaker.
They're going to be O'Connell, and O'Connell's bringing the Rams system. They're going to be 11 personnel almost nonstop. And so you would think they would have wanted to upgrade that third receiver spot.
So are you also of the opinion that KJ Osborne is not that guy?
I think that, KJ Osborne, when he's in the slot, can make plays with the football, and he can catch the ball. It seems like too obvious, but if you've watched many training camp practices, not everyone can catch the ball. If you're talking about like he can track the ball and he can make some plays in space if you scheme it up for him, I think that's totally fine. But I have a really serious question about how often Jefferson is going to be in the slot, because if you're asking Jefferson to, I think he was like 30% of the time in the slot. If you're asking him to be there then like 50% of the time, and you're moving Osborne to the outside, I don't think that's where Osborne really thrives. I don't think he's like a technician, get off the line of scrimmage, break people's ankles and get wide open. I think he's much more if you could create some space for him. Remember, he was a really good punt returner in college. Like he can make some plays in space that I think can benefit, especially when no one's paying attention to him because Thielen and Jefferson are on the outside. So I think it's a favorable spot if you run it that way. But this goes kind of back to what we were talking about defense, where it's like, if you get too crazy, like you were talking about, the offense these last few years, it's far from atrocious. It's been mostly good over the last few years. And Kirk Cousins has set his career high quarterback rating like the last 3 years that have all been over 100. And it's like, how crazy do you want to get? I think you want to tweak some things and adjust some things. But the idea that the last group was doing everything wrong, I think is totally false. And they are really, again, sort of skating on thin ice, because I think if everything goes right, they can be a top-notch offense. But if a couple things go wrong, then we're talking about probably the same as before, where it's some weeks are up when they play the Lions, or some weeks are down when they play the 49ers. And that's just kind of the life we live here.
Interesting. It'd be interesting to go in and look whether Cousins is more affected by the quality of the defenses he plays than the average quarterback. Because, right, we adjust all the quarterbacks for opponents, but we adjust them all the same. Maybe some quarterbacks have a stronger effect from playing the good opponents than other quarterbacks do. So overall, it's interesting. We have them slightly ahead of the Packers, which is, sort of shocking. The Packers have the better offensive projection. The difference is that the Vikings have the better special teams projection and schedule. Do you see them being competitive with the Packers, or do you see this year being much more likely to be, hey, can we win a wild card in a weaker NFC? Yay.
I mean, I think that everything, if we're talking about like what are the potential outcomes here? There's definitely one where Aaron Rodgers is like Nicolas Cage and past his prime in terms of his play, and starts to have that slide. And then we're talking about, no Devontae Adams there. Maybe the offensive line isn't as good. I see Bakhtiari still isn't back with them. So there's just these small things. Instead of being an unbelievable MVP player, he's much more of the guy that was there in 2018. Who is not just completely carrying everyone. And I really don't buy into, like drafting a guy in the second round and then just throwing him in with Aaron Rodgers. I think Rodgers plays by feel so much that you need to be on the same page with him, and that
exactly
will cause
what Aaron
problems.
Nagler said. It's exactly what Aaron Nagler said yesterday. Yep.
Nagler knows his stuff. I mean, if there's a Packers guy that enthusiastic who can come on my show from time to time, you know that he's good. But yeah, I mean, I think so. You talk about like there's a world where this happens. There's like their defense is supposed to be good, but as we were talking about, you're always an injury or two away from your defense not being that good. And running games kind of are what they are. So it's like if these things hit for the Vikings and they don't hit for the Packers, which does happen, then you can see it. It's not like we're talking about the Bears here where it's like, no, there's really no world where that happens. But it's sort of like I need to see it to believe it. I need to see Aaron Rodgers fall off to believe Aaron Rodgers has fallen off, because I have driven down to Lambeau Field too many times and watched that man throw footballs that I cannot believe I'm seeing in real life. And as long as he can do that, how do you tell me that it's going to be different this year and they're going to be better than the Packers?